Hey guys, this video is for APUS. I'm just going to do in this video basically what I spent a couple of weeks reading a whole book on, and I'm just going to basically summarize that book really in a few minutes. Um, it was called FDR's Last Year. It's an absolutely fantastic book. It was written by the former editor of the New York Times. And you know, this is like an area I'm really into. 1944, 1945, and it was a very readable book that really talked about the real struggles that FDR was facing, both personally and politically during these years, the 1944 and 1945. So in this video, we're going to talk about 1944. Now, as 1944 approached, FDR's health began to decline quite visibly. Like you can actually Google, if we had live class, I'd be doing this, but you could actually Google FDR 1944, and you could see just visibly how different FDR looked from what we are used to seeing him as. I'm actually going to leave a link on the bottom of this page of a clip of a speech from FDR that I want you guys to listen to. It's only a couple of minutes, so you can see just from that clip just how the decline was just like so visible in FDR. Now, what was wrong with him? The thing is that for many years FDR had very high blood pressure. Now, high blood pressure is sometimes called the silent killer in the sense that it doesn't really have really many symptoms. So people literally walk around with high blood pressure for years, not knowing they have high blood pressure, while the disease is actually wreaking a lot of havoc on their body. I have high blood pressure personally, and like I had no symptoms, and they just spotted it in a routine doctor's exam, and I've been treated for it ever since, luckily. But the thing is that if you don't go to the doctor, you don't really know you have high blood pressure until you get a major health scare, usually cardiovascular. FDR did know he had high blood pressure, but there was no treatment for high blood pressure during this time, like nothing at all. Basically, a lot of people felt that, doctors even, that high blood pressure was just a natural consequence of age. And really can't be treated. Now, that is not true. You are more likely to get high blood pressure when you're older, but I'm not, and I have it. And the thing is, I don't think I am. And the thing is that, you can wind up getting high blood pressure really at any age, and it's not an inevitable consequence of aging, but there really was no treatment. So they tell you, oh, reduce your stress, things like that, but there really was nothing really beyond that. FDR had been declining so visibly, not only in terms of his face, but he was dropping an enormous amount of weight. His attention span was really no good at a time when his attention span really needed to be really good, right? We're in the middle of the Second World War. So maybe not the middle, but still we're smack dab in the Second World War. So he really needed to be working on all cylinders. And the thing is, he was just finding it very difficult to do so. Finally, his daughter pressed him to really seek further medical advice, because his doctor was an ear, nose, and throat doctor because he had very bad sinuses, who was also prone to kind of give like very overly optimistic reports about FDR's health. So he really was not getting very good treatment at all. Finally, they brought in, at the urging of his daughter and his regular doctor, arranged for him to actually be examined by a Navy cardiologist. So there already was some suspicion that there was some cardiac problems. And when the doctor actually did the exam, like he literally couldn't believe the state of FDR's health. He diagnosed Roosevelt with congestive heart failure. That's basically a ultimately fatal disease that will ultimately stop your heart from functioning at all. Also, he had arteriosclerosis. Now, arteriosclerosis is a disease. It's a heart disease where your arteries are sclerotic, where they're clogged. Right? It's heart. It's and as well as extremely high blood pressure called malignant hypertension. So FDR had a slew of extremely serious health conditions. And they basically said you have to go on a strict diet. right? You have to cut down your smoking. FDR was a pack-a-day smoker on a good day, so usually it was even more than that. So he said you got to cut down the smoking, you got to go on a better diet, but he did that, but that actually caused him to lose even more weight, which was probably not good. Overall. So like they said basically you have to reduce your stress. So FDR on certain days actually only worked a few hours, even though World War II was going on. And other days he worked nonstop. But it kind of, what I got out of the book is it kind of went up and down. There were some times when FDR actually was feeling okay, and there were other times when FDR was feeling very, very ill. He actually spent an entire month at Bernard Baruch's plantation in South Carolina just trying to recuperate, and really doing almost no work at all. And he came back, he was better, but then sometimes, he was getting back into the routine of, this very, very hectic life of his, right? Basically running the country in the middle of this terrible, terrible war. Also, he was only 62 years old, so it wasn't like he was ancient. But 1944 marked real physical decline for Franklin Roosevelt, serious health problems, to the point where it became very difficult for him really to function at certain points. This is a little bit difficult, like trying to summarize this in a few minutes, because literally I spent weeks just reading about what I'm talking about in that book that I was just telling you about. But trying my best. Now, FDR's poor health was really kept from the public. People certainly did not know Franklin Roosevelt had, congestive heart failure or these serious, serious cardiovascular problems. But if you just looked at FDR, you kind of knew that, something was up. He looked really sick, and he looked much older than his 62 years. So FDR not only had to deal with running the country in the middle of, or again, I keep saying middle, but during the Second World War, but this was also a presidential election year, 1944. And Franklin Roosevelt really, even though it's always a little murky how much he knew about his own health condition, like how sick he was, he certainly knew he was not in good shape. And he was very, very tired all the time. And Roosevelt, in his heart of hearts, really would have been fine with leaving the presidency after his third term ended. But we're literally still fighting the Second World War. And Franklin Roosevelt actually said, how could I ask soldiers to continue to sacrifice in the middle of the war if I just up and leave? So Roosevelt he wouldn't make a decision on whether he was going to run for a fourth term until the point came when he had to run for a fourth term, if that makes any sense. Because the Democratic Party really believed there was really no other Democrat that could actually defeat FDR, that would defeat the Republicans apart from FDR. So Roosevelt waited so long to make a decision to the point where no decision was to be made anymore. He basically had to run. One of his doctors actually said, privately, that he was in no condition to actually be running for another term as president. But Roosevelt really did feel this deep sense of obligation. That he had to keep going, and that he had to, run for another 4-year term as president. So Roosevelt ultimately did that. He ran for a fourth term in the 1944 presidential election. Now, there's always this belief that New Deal idealism disappeared as soon as World War II started. It's certainly true that the priority of the government was winning the Second World War, of course, but it would be wrong to actually say that the New Deal idealism was completely gone. In fact, a lot of the war projects that FDR had actually authorized did have New Deal type purposes, trying to put more people to work, trying to locate jobs in areas of the country that were tended to be very poor. So there was still a lot of that New Deal idealism in FDR. And just to show you how true that was, Roosevelt gave a speech that literally was only discovered about 10 years ago. But it was a speech that he gave to the country in the spring of 1944, which he called for a second Bill of Rights for the American people after World War II was over. Basically saying that once the war is over, every American is entitled to a job that pays enough to live. Every American is entitled to health care. Every American is entitled to a house. Every American basically is entitled to a decent standard of living. And he said that this is a second Bill of Rights that has to be passed after the Second World War was over. And I'm actually going to leave that speech in, at the bottom of this video, and I really want you guys to listen to it. It's only about 2 minutes. Please listen to it. And I always think that speech was very, it was very revealing, because it showed that even though World War II was going on, even though he was very sick, he was in the middle of a presidential election where he's going to, as usual, be tarred as overly liberal. Roosevelt still kept a lot of that New Deal idealism and really envisioned a post-war world that basically would call for an expansion of the welfare state, to actually provide more protections for the American people. That's what every country in Western Europe did after the Second World War. Britain, France, West Germany, Scandinavia, they all decided that the government does have a major role to play in making sure that all their citizens have the basic necessities of life, universal health care, etc. So Western Europe went in that direction after the Second World War. So I guess the question is, if would FDR want the United States to go in that direction as well once the war was over? And if you listen to the Second Bill of Rights speech, you definitely have to conclude that yes, he did want the U.S. to go in that direction of actually providing basic guarantees of the necessities of life to all the people in this country. Now, Roosevelt was nominated, so please watch that speech, the link I'm going to leave you. Now, Roosevelt was nominated for a fourth term by the Democratic Party, really facing no opposition at all, despite the visible decline in his health. But the big question became who would be FDR's running mate. Now, FDR's vice president was a man named Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was an ultra liberal, like super left, to the point where he was accused, with some basis, honestly, of being sympathetic to the communists, or at least sympathetic to far left elements of the political spectrum. Wallace also was kind of flaky. He had some strange correspondence with a Russian mystic, under an alias. He had actually been given some basic bureaucratic jobs by Roosevelt, and he really messed them all up. So there was really like this feeling that Wallace had to go, especially when everybody just saw what FDR's physical condition was. He was declining, right? So the thing is that a lot of Democrats said it's especially important to pick a vice president who could actually become president if something happened to Roosevelt. It's kind of unsaid. Like, nobody told Roosevelt, well, you think you're going to die, so let me be a good vice president. But, it almost didn't have to be said. So Roosevelt, who could be a very slick politician, did not actually want to tell Wallace that he was not, sorry about that. He did not want to tell Wallace that he did not want him to be vice president. So Roosevelt actually tried to be like super slick and told Wallace, well, if I was a delegate, I would support you, which is kind of not very committal. While at the same time, the Democratic Party was actually planning to replace Henry Wallace with a new running mate, Franklin Roosevelt. They kind of drifted around and said they thought of a different bunch of names. Jim Burns, who was who was a former Supreme Court justice, who was one of Roosevelt's chief wartime bureaucrats. He was in charge of a major war mobilization agency, very close to Roosevelt, but he was a Southerner known as a segregationist. He was a Catholic who had actually left the faith. So Roosevelt thought that Burns had too much baggage. Finally, the Democratic Party kind of presented Roosevelt with the name of Harry Truman, who was a senator from Missouri, who had actually made a kind of a name for himself by exposing fraud in wartime industry. And Roosevelt made clear that Truman was totally acceptable to him. But again, he would not make a firm commitment out of concern that it would antagonize not only Wallace personally, but a lot of left-wing Democrats who supported Henry Wallace. Because Wallace was very popular among a lot of liberals. Finally, at the actual convention, Wallace actually maintained a quite significant amount of support until finally the Democratic Party decided to nominate Harry Truman, make him the vice president, make him Franklin Roosevelt's running mate in the 1944 election. So it was FDR and Truman running in 1944. Now, the Republicans decided to nominate the 42-year-old governor of New York, a man named Thomas Dewey. Dewey had been the DA of Manhattan, the guy who went after the mafia and had this reputation as this mob busting almost hero, not almost, literally hero. The mob put a hit on Dewey, tried to whack him, and Dewey kind of rode that fame of going after the mafia to getting elected governor of New York in 1942, and now in 1944, the Republicans nominated him for president. Dewey was fairly moderate by Republican standards. He, to his credit, really did not vocally oppose the war effort, even though he criticized the way FDR had kind of managed the war, and he also continued criticism of the New Deal. Now, the Republicans went on the attack. Now, even though they didn't, say, really attack per se, Roosevelt's conduct of the war, they basically said that it's time for a change. And the line that the Republicans used in the 44 election was, we must get rid of the tired old men who've been running this country for so long. Remember, FDR had first been elected in 1932. And that argument did have some resonance. There were some people who just get tired of you after a while. After you've been in power for a very long time. Even someone like FDR. Plus, a lot of Roosevelt voters were off fighting the Second World War. So this election actually turned into a much tougher one than you might think for Franklin Roosevelt. The campaign did get very dirty. Dewey was trying to link FDR with communist causes, basically saying that communist-dominated unions were the ones who were really pulling the strings in the Roosevelt campaign. And Roosevelt himself said afterwards that this was the meanest campaign of my life, because it got very personal. Where Dewey and the Republicans are basically saying that he's not fit to be president anymore. Even though I guess you could argue that due to his health problems, Roosevelt actually, you could argue, was he really fit to be president? Roosevelt really felt the need to actually go out and campaign, to try to show that, he was still vigorous. Remember, he's still dealing with polio too, so campaigning always was a bit of a challenge, but especially considering his health situation. So he decided in October 1944 to go on a 5-borough tour. I don't think he hit that out. So a 4-borough tour of New York City. New York was actually a swing state back then because the city was very Democratic, but upstate was very Republican. So it was always very tough to gauge who actually had the advantage. It was very swingy, and especially now both the Democratic and Republican candidates, FDR and Dewey, are both from New York, both governors, or FDR's case, former governor. So Roosevelt did a 4-borough tour of New York City, and it was pouring rain. And Roosevelt basically, had to give a speech in one borough after another borough in pouring rain. He literally, when he finished these speeches, they put him back in his car. They took him into a garage where he was shaking so badly, because he was sick and he had just been standing out in the rain and the cold, where they had to dry him off, put a new suit on him, then put him back in the car to go to the next stop. And he literally carried on with that routine for the entire day. It was like a 10-12 hour day for Franklin Roosevelt. So he did this as a way to try to hide his declining health. Even though he was very, very sick while he was actually doing this tour. Roosevelt also tried to make a few other campaign appearances. One was turned out to be a really big political hit for Franklin Roosevelt, because the Republicans actually charged that Roosevelt had left his pet dog in Alaska, Fala, and it actually sent a Navy destroyer to retrieve his dog from Alaska. That is not true. And Roosevelt decided to kind of make a big joke out of it, where at a Union dinner, Roosevelt actually said, the Republicans are not content to attack me or my wife or my sons, because his sons have been criticized quite a bit because of some business activities of theirs. He said, now they're attacking my dog Fala, and I don't mind, and my wife doesn't mind, and my children don't mind, but Fala does mind. And it was a huge hit. Roosevelt really could turn it on. He was very, very charming. And Roosevelt, even at 50% capacity was still better than almost any other politician, not only in terms of his ability to win elections, but also in his ability to continue to run the country, despite his health situation. Now, unions play an instrumental role in trying to drum up votes for FDR. And in the end of the day, voters again responded to FDR's appeal. This was a man who was beloved by so much of the country, right? The man who rescued the country from the Great Depression and was currently leading the country through the Second World War. And voters stuck with FDR in the 1944 election, but by the slimmest margin of any of his 4 elections. He won 53% of the vote to 46% for Dewey. The Electoral College was pretty sweeping. 432 electoral votes for FDR, 99 electoral votes for Dewey, but that was still closer than his other elections. Dewey actually waited a very long time to actually concede. Roosevelt actually waited until the middle of the night to actually get that phone call from Dewey conceding the election. He didn't get it until the next day, and Roosevelt apparently said afterwards, well, I still think he's a son of a bitch, because the election had really, in FDR's mind, had been unnecessarily negative. But now Roosevelt was elected to another term, another 4 years. If he survived this term, he'd be president for 16 years. He wouldn't leave office until January 1949. And Roosevelt himself knew that it was going to be very, very difficult, to actually make it through another 4 years. But there were so many challenges in front of Roosevelt now. He had to wind down World War II. He was really focused on building a United Nations, because remember, he's a Wilsonian, that he thought would keep the peace. He wanted to nurture, or at least continue decent relations with the Soviet Union so they would join the United Nations. But then he had to also face the issue of what to do about communist expansion into Eastern Europe. We still need the Russians, but they're doing a lot of messed up stuff that Roosevelt, really had problems with. But how much is he going to stand up to them? That's what we're going to talk about in the next video. All right, guys, very good. So remember, watch these videos from start to finish, and I'll be leaving you another video to watch on Wednesday for asynchronous. All right, guys. Till then, peace.